Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 9. We're almost at spring break. We've got 1 week to go, so we're getting close, right? But of course, before we get to spring break, you guys have the midterm exam to take. So the midterm is this week, and it will be up at the latest Friday morning at 7 a.m., and then you'll have until Saturday midnight to complete it. I'm going to try to get it up on Thursday sometime, so I'll actually post an announcement when I actually have it up and ready for you guys to take. It's a combination of true, false, multiple choice, and short essay questions, right? So there will be a combination of 20 multiple choice and true, false questions, just like the quizzes, and then there will be 5 short essay questions. And by short essay, I mean minimum 2 paragraphs, 2 to 3 paragraphs to answer these questions. Similar to what I'm looking for in the weekly discussion posts. The major difference between this and the quizzes is that this is closed book, right? So not just closed book, closed notes, closed computer, closed everything, right? You're supposed to take this independently. Well, I guess you have to have your computers open to take it, right? But you know what I mean. No going to Google and all this. And unfortunately, in the past, I've had students who have went to a website and copied and pasted and put it in. And if you do that, I'm going to know it. Okay, I'm going to be able to recognize the difference between your everyday regular writing and the stuff that somebody spent hours crafting on a website, right? So don't do that, because that's grounds for failing class and receiving some sort of academic warning. So please don't do that. Just use your knowledge to the best of your abilities based on what we've been learning in the class. It's going to be on the topics that we've covered thus far, right? So look at the stuff that we've covered, especially Quiz 2. Quiz 2 would be a good indicator, all right, because Quiz 2 was sort of comprehensive as far as the materials go. So review Quiz 2. Just make sure that you understand the basics of each of the topics that are listed on the syllabus for each week that we've done, right? And once again, going back to the discussion posts would be a really wise move in trying to figure out what the short essay questions might be, right? Because they won't be the exact same question, but they'll be related to them, I would assume. Okay, so we've got that. I posted your first 5 weeks participation grades just to give you guys an idea of where you are and what your level of participation looks like as far as grades go. If you guys have questions on those, let me know. Also, if you missed a week and you want to go back and make it up, send me an email and we can probably arrange something. You'll get partial credit, you won't get full credit, but that'll definitely be better than getting a 0 if you don't do anything. So I'm willing to work with you to make that stuff up. Also, the quizzes, there was the confusing question on Quiz 2 regarding how much of a majority or how much do you need to secure the nomination, how many delegates do you need to secure the nomination. I went in and added points to those people who answered either 50 or 51% to that question. So if you haven't seen that show up on your quiz, let me know if you answered one of those two particular things. Okay, so we're kind of veering away from the presidency a little bit, and of course it's still going to be in the background with the elections this year. But this past week we actually looked a little bit at American political culture. I know what an interesting time it is to study American political culture with what's going on with the elections, with Trump and with Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz and all these different. In a way, you hear it mentioned in presidential elections, people having certain lanes, right? So there's the establishment lane, and then there's the Trump angry voters lane, and then there's the Ted Cruz evangelical lane, and there's the Bernie Sanders maybe socialist, more progressive lane, right? So you have all these different lanes, and essentially what those lanes are indicating is that there are different political cultures in the United States that each one of these candidates is trying to appeal to. So this past week I had you guys read David Brooks' article. David Brooks is a great political commentator. He writes for the New York Times, I think a bi-weekly or maybe even 3 times a week editorial column. So if you found this article interesting, I would recommend that you you can just Google David Brooks and his columns will come up, and just read his columns on a regular basis. So anyway, this week we looked at his article about red America versus blue America, right? And trying to see if there were like these, is there a chasm, right? Is there a Grand Canyon between red America and blue America? Well, first we have to define what we're talking about when we're talking about red America and blue America. Obviously, a lot of people know that it refers to when they're looking at calculating which states are going to vote for which presidential candidates. Red states, red represents Republicans, so we've got a little bit of matching there. Republican and red both start with R, right? And blue represents Democratic states. And now you're starting to hear the language, and Brooks doesn't talk about this, but you're starting to hear the language of purple states, right? So maybe Florida is now a purple state, which kind of means that there's a pretty much equal distribution between red and blue in the state. So, red plus blue equals purple kind of thing, right? So a lot of the swing states are now called purple states. So Florida, a lot of people are looking at Florida as a purple state. Ohio as a purple state, right? So these are the swing states that have a pretty equal distribution among the political parties and among those political cultures, right? So Brooks kind of gives this analogy of Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., which is, very affluent suburbs, people eating at, shopping at Whole Foods and going to soccer and lacrosse matches and private schools and the arts and all these sorts of things, right? We think about with more urban lifestyles perhaps being very environmentally concerned. Right? And then a red America, the more conservative values, right? Maybe religion plays more of a role. People are very concerned about their communities. They're more interested in maybe outdoor activities like hiking or hunting or not SUVs, ATVs, right? That's the difference. In blue America, you've got SUVs, and in red America, you've got ATVs, right? Four-wheelers and things like that. So, of course, that's a very generic description of these places, right? Because I think a lot of you pointed out in the discussions that, in a small town like, the Chambersburg, right, that he's talking about in Pennsylvania, it's not everybody is a raging Republican, gun-toting hunter kind of thing, and not everybody's poor, not everybody's not well educated. You have a mix of these things, but Brooks is pointing out general trends about the way things are, right? So he's speaking in generalities, and of course that's always open to criticism, but it still may have some useful import for analyzing the particular political culture of the United States, right? So he talks about these two different areas and how different they are, and then he tries to sort of explain, well, why do we have this? What are the theories that actually explain the distinction between red America and blue America in the United States? And he starts off with Bernie Sanders' favorite theory, right? The economic theory. You have the 1% who has everything, right? And then you have everybody at the 99%, right? So Brooks calls this the theory of the haves versus the have-nots, right? And he says, you ask people in red America if there's a culture war, and they don't know what the heck you're talking about, right? And it's not because they're not educated; it's just they don't think about things in that particular way. But he said, if you ask the question, is America full of haves and have-nots? Pretty much everybody gets that, and everybody says, yes, it is, right? The interesting thing that Brooks points out about the haves versus the have-nots is he says that everybody that he talked to, everybody considered themselves to be a have, right? So that's one of the advantages of living in a very wealthy westernized country, right? Is even the people that we consider to be poor are actually pretty well off in comparison with a lot of the rest of the world. Okay, so you got this thing about the haves and the have-nots, and he says, it really doesn't play out that way because, the cost of living is much lower in a lot of the areas, a lot of red America areas, right? So you can actually get by with a lot less money than you can in somewhere like Washington, D.C., where it's going to cost you, $2,000 a month to rent a 2-bedroom apartment or something like that. So you got the first is the haves and the have-nots, right? The next thing is this sort of there's a moral distinction or a religious distinction between red America and blue America. Red America is very religious, very Christian, and blue America is very secular, and they're not interested in religion. They're much more focused on, their own independent worldly views, right? And Brooks said, yeah, there is some element of this in red America, but he said, it's almost superficial in a way, because he said that the same problems that you see in blue America also exist in red America, right? So it's not, that the red America is holier than thou, because you go into the communities and you see these substance abuse problems, and you see all the issues that, that we hear actually happening in the more urban blue areas. They're still going on, right? So maybe it's not this, great moral distinction between red America and blue America. And the last theory that he proposes, and the one that he eventually settles on, is that it has to do with ego, right? Or people's sentiment about themselves, how they see themselves, right? And in red America, he said that people see themselves, the individual, as very small, right? It's not about you. You're not trying to do everything you can to stand out. You're not wearing flashy clothes. You're not driving around, BMWs and status symbols and things like that. You're trying to essentially blend in and be part of the community. He said things like civility, politeness, all these sorts of things, are play a really big role in, places like Franklin County, Pennsylvania, or Franklin, Pennsylvania, right? So, and he contrasted that to blue America, where in blue America, the individual is very big, right? So we're doing everything we can to try to get ourselves to stand out, right? And we're, constantly trying to further our own individual, causes, our careers, climbing the career ladder, making ourselves stand out. But he did say that there are different ways that people do that, right? He talked about the people who are business school grads and law school grads, and he said that they measure their worth by how much space they have over their heads, right? So whether it's driving a huge SUV or living in a house that's like a cathedral, versus the more granola, I guess you could call them, right, eco-friendly people living in blue America, where they intentionally are trying to be as environmentally friendly and reducing their carbon footprint and all that sort of stuff. But it's all about the individual, right? At least that's what Brooks was saying. And he's saying that's the major distinction, right? That maybe you could think about it this way: in red America, the community comes first and then the individual, versus in blue America, the individual comes first and then the community. So where do you fall on that spectrum, right? Which is the traditional liberal versus Republican debate, right? Because in liberalism, so this explains a little bit about why Democrats are traditionally thought of as liberal and Republicans are traditionally thought of as conservative, right? So, liberalism, in its classical sense, means freedom of the individual, right? So an individual is free to do essentially whatever they want, right? So we associate that individuality, at least in classical liberalism, with the Democratic Party, right? And once again, that maps onto sort of this notion of blue America, right? Classical republicanism puts the community, the needs of the community, the needs of the group before the needs of the individual, right? So we can say republicanism, maps on to this, classical view of this, the group over the individual, and that maps on to the red states. So this understanding of conservative values, which harkens back to the classical Republican values, ties in that way. So anyway, that's how Brooks describes them. But then he also goes on to say that, look, we think about this, going back to his initial question, is this an unbridgeable gap? He says, no, it's not an unbridgeable gap, right? He says maybe it's there are more cracks than there are an actual chasm or canyon between these two. And he said, rather than thinking about it that way, perhaps the best metaphor to think about it is the high school cafeteria, right, where you walk in and you have all the different groups that are hanging out, right? But at the end of the day, maybe on Friday night when the high school football game comes on, all those people who are in the cafeteria are there in the stands cheering for their team, right? Kind of the same idea with America, right? We have these different cliques, we have these different groups in our society, but the thing that unites us and makes us Americans are the political beliefs and the political values that we hang on to. Sure, Republicans and Democrats have different beliefs on perhaps the interpretation of the Constitution, but they certainly believe in the Constitution and what the Constitution and Bill of Rights stands for, right? So it's just taking it up another level of abstraction. So that was the little piece on American political culture. I thought you guys made some really good observations. Some people said rather than thinking about, Montgomery County versus Franklin County, Pennsylvania, let's think about Sarasota versus Myakka, right, as perhaps a more local analog of a way to actually think about this issue. And people, generally thought that we could, say that we're a united people, even amongst these different cliques and these different social groups that we have in the United States, though it's an interesting time to be thinking about this, right? Because we see that the Republican Party in particular seems so splintered right now between, people who are so angry, and you wonder how many people in Red America who it seems like we're trying to put at least in Brooks's story, trying to put the group first are now really upset, and perhaps they're trying to express their own individual anger at the economic conditions, the economic and political situation, right? So are you seeing in this election, perhaps a little bit more fracturing going on in American political culture? It would certainly seem that way, but it's still early in the day, right? So it's hard to say at this point. Typically what happens, and the reason that, 9/11 is a good example, right? But sometimes it's not a telling example either, because of course people are going to come together in the face of that national tragedy, right? So, but what about the rest of the time, right? Can we actually come together? And what does it take? I guess that's a better question. Is what does it take to actually make us come together and take action as a United States, right? And as one particular culture. Does it take a disaster on the scale of 9/11? Or are there disasters going on every day in our country, right? Like incarceration rates, and education and lack of quality education and homelessness and all these other issues. Why do these issues not rise to the same level of tragedy that something like 9/11 does, right? Because a lot more people are dying in mass shootings over the past, since 9/11. A lot more people have died in mass shootings than have died in 9/11, right? So why does that not bring us together in the same way that something like 9/11 does? Maybe it's because we have a common enemy that we can point to in this case and say, well, it's the Taliban or it's Al-Qaeda or it's ISIS that can actually bring us together. Anyway, that's it for this week on American political culture. Look for the midterm. I will post an announcement letting you guys know when it's available.